It's hard to believe, but for a time the Germans openly mocked American pilots in the dark. They were flying blind, and the Axis knew exactly why. Thousands of young American crews were sent into the dark skies of Europe, effectively blind. The Germans laughed at their attempts until one small British box changed the entire war. We all know the 8th Air Force mastered the daylight raid, but what about the night? For months, their night recon was a failure, a joke to the Germans, all because they were missing one single piece of technology. Thousands of young American crews were sent into the dark skies of Europe, effectively blind. The Germans laughed at their attempts until one small British box changed the entire war. This is the story of how that one invention, born from a desperate mission, not only ended the mockery but ultimately broke the back of the Third Reich. It's a story of genius, of desperation, and of the technology that finally allowed the Allies to see in the dark. Welcome to Part 19 of our series. In 1942, the strategic bombing campaign against Germany was failing, and it was failing badly. For the British, Bomber Command under Sir Arthur "Bomber" Harris was tasked with a monumental objective – dehouse the German worker, destroy the industrial capacity of the Reich, and break the will of the German people. It was a brutal strategy, born of the desperation of a nation that had stood alone for so long. But there was a fundamental problem. To hit a target, you must first find it, and in the vast, blacked-out expanse of nighttime Europe, finding a specific factory, a rail yard, or even an entire city was proving to be almost impossible. The brave crews of the RAF's Lancasters and Halifaxes were flying hundreds of miles over hostile territory, facing determined Luftwaffe night fighters, acres of deadly flak, and the relentless cold of the upper atmosphere. They were using what was then state-of-the-art navigation, dead reckoning, celestial navigation, and primitive radio aids. It was a matter of grit, guts, and a prayer. But prayers, it turned out, were not accurate bombing systems. The results were sobering. A landmark investigation in 1941, the Butt Report, delivered a shocking verdict. Of all the crews who claimed to have hit their target, only 1 in 3 had dropped its bombs within 5 miles of it. 5 miles! Not 500 yards, 5 miles. In the critical industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, that number dropped to a staggering 1 in 10. This wasn't just a failure of technology. It was a crisis of faith in the entire strategic bombing concept. The Germans, naturally, were well aware of this. Their defenses, particularly the sophisticated Kammhuber line orchestrated by General Joseph Kammhuber, were exacting a terrible toll. This line was the belt of radar stations, searchlights, and night fighter airfields stretching from Denmark down to France. It was a technological fortress, and the British bombers were flying right into its teeth night after night. The German night fighter pilots, the Nachtjäger, were becoming aces, guided to their prey by ground controllers who could see the British formations on their radar screens. The British, meanwhile, were effectively blind. They were being tracked, intercepted, and shot down in horrific numbers, often without even knowing how they were found. The German controllers and pilots developed a grim professional arrogance. They knew the British were coming, they knew where they were going, and they knew they couldn't hit what they were aiming for. The mockery had begun.
Into this grim scenario stepped the Americans, the Yankees. When the United States Army Air Forces, the USAAF, began building up their 8th Air Force in England in 1942, they brought with them a different doctrine, a profoundly American one. They believed in technology, in precision, and in the firepower of their magnificent new bomber, the B-17 Flying Fortress. Their plan was not to bomb cities at night, but to strike specific, high-value industrial targets, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and submarine pens in broad daylight. Their confidence was immense. They believed their B-17s, bristling with 13 50-caliber machine guns, could defend themselves in tight combat box formations. They believed their pilots, trained to the highest standards, could fly through the flak. And most of all, they believed in the Norden bombsight. This was a mechanical computer, a marvel of its age that, in theory, could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The British, including Harris and Churchill, were deeply skeptical. They had already tried daylight bombing in 1939 and 1940 and had been slaughtered. They warned the Americans, led by the confident General Ira Eaker, that they were flying into a buzzsaw. The Americans, full of can-do spirit, politely disagreed. They had to try. And so they did. Throughout late 1942 and into 1943, the 8th Air Force began its daylight campaign, striking targets in occupied France and then, tentatively, into Germany itself. At first, when targets were within range of Allied fighter escort, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, the missions were costly but sustainable. But the core targets, the heart of German industry, lay deep within the Reich, far beyond the range of any escort fighter. This led to the defining, tragic moments of the daylight campaign. August 1943, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg mission, a dual strike against ball-bearing plants and an aircraft plant. The 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers. 60! Not 60 airmen, but 60 10-man bombers. 600 men in a single day. Then came October 1943, Black Thursday, the second raid on Schweinfurt. This time, it was even worse. Of the 291 bombers dispatched, 60 were shot down over Germany, another 17 were destroyed in crashes, and 121 were heavily damaged. It was a loss rate of nearly 25%. No force could sustain such losses. The 8th Air Force was effectively broken. The daylight precision campaign was halted. This is where the Axis mockery, once directed primarily at the fumbling British, found a new and even more deserving target: the Yankees. The German propaganda machine went into overdrive. The Luftwaffe pilots, men like Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, the night ghost of Sint-Trond, or the daylight aces like Adolf Galland, held the American daylight strategy in contempt. They saw it as mass suicide. The Americans were bravely flying their formations straight into the teeth of the German fighter wings and being systematically annihilated. But what about night reconnaissance, the title of this piece? With the daylight campaign a bloody failure, what were the American options? They had to gather intelligence. They had to know what was happening at night. But here they were even blinder than the British. The RAF, for all its bombing inaccuracies, had been forced to develop sophisticated night-flying techniques and electronic countermeasures. They had beams, radio aids, and the beginnings of a counter-strategy. The Americans, focused entirely on their daylight doctrine, had almost none of this. An American B-17 or B-24 sent on a solo night reconnaissance mission was a lonely, blind, and doomed aircraft. German radar would pick it up instantly. A night fighter would be vectored in. And the American crew, with no specialized night vision equipment, no ground mapping radar, and no tail warning systems, would be a sitting duck. It was so ineffective that it was rarely even tried in a systematic way. The Germans knew this. They knew the Americans were a daylight-only force, and they knew that force was currently bleeding to death. The mockery wasn't just laughter. It was a deep, tactical arrogance the Reich's defenders felt in late 1943. They had the measure of both Allied air forces. The British were clumsy at night, and the Americans were suicidal by day.
This entire grim situation, the failure of the RAF, the breaking of the 8th Air Force, the arrogance of the Luftwaffe, all of it hinged on one simple fact. The Allies could not reliably see their targets. The problem was existential. If they couldn't solve it, the entire strategic bombing campaign, the most expensive and complex military effort ever undertaken, would fail, and the war might be lost. But there was a secret that had been carried across the Atlantic in 1940, in the darkest days of the war. This is where Sir Henry Tizard enters the story. Tizard was a brilliant British chemist and inventor, a key figure in the development of radar before the war even began. He was a quiet, practical man who understood, better than almost anyone, that this would be a war of technology, a war fought by scientists in laboratories as much as by soldiers in the field. In the summer of 1940, with Britain facing imminent invasion, Tizard led one of the most important missions of the entire war, a mission so secret its details weren't fully known for decades, the Tizard Mission. He gathered up all of Britain's most advanced, most secret military technologies, put them in a single black box, a literal locked trunk, and sailed for the United States, a neutral country. He was, in effect, giving away the crown jewels. Why? Because Britain might not survive. Tizard knew that if Britain fell, these secrets would fall with it. But if he could get them to the Americans, they might have the industrial power to develop them and, perhaps, one day use them to liberate Europe. It was an incredible gamble. Inside that black box was the key to everything. It wasn't a complete radar set. It was something small, unassuming, but world-changing. It was the cavity magnetron. This one device, no bigger than a shoebox, was the breakthrough the world had been waiting for. Before the cavity magnetron, radar sets were huge, lumbering things that operated on long wavelengths. They were fine for detecting ships at sea or large formations of bombers from the ground, like the British chain-home system that won the Battle of Britain. But they were far too large and their resolution far too poor to be fitted into an aircraft for hunting U-boats or, crucially, for mapping the ground. The cavity magnetron, developed by John Randall and Harry Boot at the University of Birmingham, was a revelation. It could generate powerful microwave frequency pulses operating on a 10-centimeter wavelength. This was a quantum leap. This centimetric radar could be made small enough to fit in the nose of a bomber, and its short wavelength meant it could produce a much clearer, more detailed picture. When Tizard and his team presented this device to the stunned American scientists at the MIT Radiation Laboratory, the Rad Lab, it galvanized them. The Americans, with their vast resources, immediately set to work mass-producing and refining it. The cavity magnetron was the birth of modern radar. It would win the Battle of the Atlantic by allowing planes to hunt U-boats on the surface at night. And it would, eventually, solve the problem of night bombing. Back in Britain, scientists were in a race. They knew the Tizard mission had given the technology to the Americans, but the need was immediate. They had to get a ground-mapping radar into their own bombers now. The development was codenamed H2S. The origin of the name is the stuff of legend. Some say it stood for Home Sweet Home, as it was supposed to get the crews back. But the more likely story is that when the project's lead scientist, Bernard Lovell, was describing the idea, one of Lord Cherwell's aides, frustrated with another magic project, wrote H2S in the margin of his notes. H2S, the chemical formula for hydrogen sulfide, the smell of rotten eggs. This new project, he was implying, stank. The name stuck. But the project did not stink. It was genius. The team, working at a frantic pace, figured out how to mount a cavity magnetron in the belly of a bomber. It had a curved, scanning antenna. This antenna would send out a pulse of microwave energy, which would bounce off the ground below. The key was in how it returned. Water absorbed the microwaves, so it appeared black. Open land, like fields, scattered them weakly, so it appeared gray. But dense man-made structures, cities, buildings, factories, these reflected the beams strongly. They glowed. And all of this was displayed on a revolutionary new screen, the Plan Position Indicator, or PPI. For the first time, a navigator wasn't just hearing a blip in his headphones. He was looking at a screen, a glowing green and black top-down map of the ground he was flying over, even through solid clouds or in the dead of night. He could see the coastline of Europe appear. He could see the dark ribbon of a river. And he could see the bright, cancerous smear of a city.
The team, testing it over England, famously identified a town on the screen, and Lovell remarked, "There it is. It's a map. It's just like a map." The implications were staggering. No more guessing. No more dropping bombs 5 miles wide. You could fly directly to the glowing shape of the city on your screen and drop your bombs right in the center. Bomber Harris, upon seeing the first H2S images, knew this was his war-winning weapon. He demanded it, and he demanded it now. He wanted H2S in every one of his heavy bombers. There was, however, a massive, terrifying risk. This was the cavity magnetron, the single most important British technological secret. What if a bomber equipped with H2S was shot down over Germany? The Germans would get their hands on it. They would understand centimetric radar. They would copy it. They would develop countermeasures. They would develop their own airborne radar, making their night fighters even deadlier. The scientific and military leadership was split. Tizard himself argued against its use, fearing the secret was too big to risk. But Harris was adamant. He argued that the war was being lost now. He said, "The war will be over by the time the Germans can copy it. We must use it." Harris won the argument. The first H2S sets were rushed into production and fitted to a special group of Pathfinder aircraft. Their job was to fly ahead of the main bomber stream, use H2S to find the target, and drop brightly colored target indicators, massive pyrotechnic flares, to mark the aiming point for the hundreds of bombers following behind. The first operational use of H2S was in January 1943 against the city of Hamburg. The results were immediate and astounding. The Pathfinders marked the target perfectly. The main force, guided by the flares, delivered a devastatingly accurate raid. But the fear of compromise was realized almost immediately. On only its second mission, a Pathfinder Sterling bomber was shot down near Rotterdam. The H2S set was recovered, mostly intact, by the Germans. The secret was out. The Germans were stunned. They called the device the Rotterdam Garret, the Rotterdam device. They immediately realized its significance. German scientists who had previously dismissed microwaves as impractical were now in a panic. They set to work trying to understand it and, more importantly, to counter it. This would lead to new German radars and detectors like the Naxos system, designed to home in on H2S emissions. The technological war in the air had just entered a new, frantic phase. But for the Allies, the genie was out of the bottle. The effectiveness of H2S was proven beyond all doubt. The single greatest demonstration came in July 1943 with Operation Gomorrah, the Battle of Hamburg. For a week, British and American bombers attacked the city around the clock. The Americans bombed by day, and the British, using H2S, bombed by night. The H2S-equipped Pathfinders marked the city with chilling precision. The resulting firestorm was something the world had never seen. It was an inferno that created its own weather, with winds of 150 miles per hour and temperatures of 800 degrees. The city was incinerated. 45,000 people were killed in a week. It was a terrible, brutal vindication of Harris's strategy, and it was made possible only by H2S. Now let's return to the Americans, the Yankees. Remember, at this exact same time, July 1943, the 8th Air Force was just weeks away from its Black Thursday disaster at Schweinfurt.
While the British were proving they could wipe a city off the map at night, the Americans were proving they could not survive in the daylight. The contrast was stark. The British had solved their blindness, the Americans were still paying for it in blood.
So, what about the Yankee night Recon? The Americans were not fools. They knew about H2S. The Tizard Mission had given the core technology to their own scientists at the MIT Rad Lab. And those scientists had been working on it ever incredibly fast. They weren't just copying H2S, they were improving it. The American version was codenamed H2X, or Mickey, and it had a crucial difference. We're about to get into the science, and it's fascinating, but I'm curious. What piece of forgotten wartime tech do you think really tipped the scales? Let us know in the comments below. We read all of them, and it helps us find new stories to tell. The British H2S operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength, or S-band. This was revolutionary, but the MIT Rad Lab, with the full force of American industrial research, had managed to perfect an even shorter wavelength, the 3-centimeter, or X-band. Why did this matter? A shorter wavelength means a smaller antenna, and more importantly, a much, much higher resolution. If the British H2S could show you the glowing smear of a city, the American H2X could show you the individual docks of the harbor. It could distinguish between a dense factory complex and the residential blocks next to it. It was, in short, a true precision instrument, perfectly suited to the American doctrine of precision bombing. The H2X sets were rushed into production, but the American strategy was still focused on daylight bombing. They didn't initially see H2X as a night bombing tool, as the British did. They saw it as the solution to their daylight problem. What was the biggest enemy of the Norden bombsight? It wasn't flak or fighters. It was clouds. The thick, persistent, industrial haze and cloud cover of Northern Europe. A B-17 crew could fly for 8 hours, fight its way through hundreds of fighters, lose half its squadron, and arrive over the target only to find it completely obscured by clouds. They would be forced to turn around, or even worse, drop their bombs on estimation, which was just as bad as the British blind bombing of 1941. It was maddening. H2X changed the game. It was a radar bomb sight. It allowed a bombardier to see the target through the clouds. Now an American B-17 Pathfinder equipped with H2X could lead a formation over a target that was completely socked in. The lead bombardier would watch his radar screen, identify the glowing shape of the factory or the rail yard, and release his bombs. The rest of the formation, hundreds of bombers, would release their bombs on his signal. This was called bombing through overcast, or BTO, and it saved the 8th Air Force. After the disaster of Black Thursday in October 1943, the 8th Air Force was forced to stand down for long periods. But by early 1944, two things had arrived that would change the war. First, the P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter that could finally escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. Second, H2X radar. Now the 8th Air Force was an all-weather force. If the skies would clear, they would use the pinpoint-accurate Norden bombsight. If the skies were overcast, they would use the still incredibly good H2X radar. There was nowhere left for German industry to hide. The mockery stopped. It stopped completely. The German defenders who had once laughed at the clumsy British and the suicidal Americans were now facing a relentless round-the-clock assault. The RAF, using H2S, was destroying their cities by night. The USAF, using H2X and fighter escorts, was destroying their factories by day, even in bad weather. And what about that Yankee night Recon? With H2X, the Americans finally had the tool to do it. While the main mission of the 8th remained daylight bombing, they began to use H2X-equipped Mickey ships for special night missions. They could fly solo reconnaissance runs deep into Germany, mapping targets, assessing bomb damage from the night's RAF raid, and identifying new targets, all from the relative safety of the high-altitude darkness. Their radar screens gave them a picture clearer than any spy photographed. They were no longer blind. They were, in fact, the all-seeing eye. The German night fighter force, which had been so dominant, was now completely overwhelmed. Their Rotterdam device-derived detectors, which helped them find the British 10-centimeter H2S,
were useless against the American 3-centimeter X2X, which used a different frequency. The Germans were, in turn, blinded. They were being bombed by an enemy they couldn't see day or night. The technological arrogance that had defined the Luftwaffe in 1942 and 1943 had completely evaporated. It was replaced by a grim, fatalistic despair. They were being technologically outmatched and industrially buried.
The story of H2S and H2X is the story of the entire air war in miniature. It was a constant, desperate battle of scientists and engineers. The Germans had the Kammhuber line. The British countered with window or chaff, massive clouds of aluminum strips dropped to blind the German radar. The Germans countered with new radar frequencies. The British countered with H2S. The Germans captured H2S and developed the Naxos detector. The Americans then trumped them all with the 3-centimeter H2X, a weapon the Germans simply could not counter or copy in time. The Axis mockery of Yankee night Recon was perfectly justified, for a time. It was based on a real and fatal technological gap. The Americans were blind. They were a daylight force, and a failing one at that. But that mockery died in the firestorms of Hamburg and the rubble of Berlin. It was silenced by a small, unassuming metal box born in a British university, gifted to the Americans by the Tizard Mission and perfected in the laboratories of MIT. It was the radar that gave the bombers their eyes. It's a powerful reminder that wars are not just won by courage, though that was present in abundance. They are won by intelligence, by innovation, and by the relentless pursuit of a technological edge. The crews who flew those missions were some of the bravest men our nation has ever produced. But their bravery alone was not enough. They needed a tool. Tizard's legacy, the cavity magnetron, and the H2S and H2X radars it powered was the tool that finally allowed their courage to deliver victory. If this story honored the men who flew those missions, the best way to support this channel is to share this video with a friend or family member who also respects this history. This was a complex story, and we've only scratched the surface of the electronic war. Learn more about the electronic war and the Battle of Britain by clicking the link on your screen. And, as always, we thank you for your time and for helping us keep this history alive.